conditions. I gathered material for this book in the course of several journeys to the Sahara. One of my earliest memories is of a calm night in the great eastern Erg, the sea of sand that covers thousands of square miles in the northeast. Some friends and I had started from the busy market town of El Oud, some 400 miles inland from Algiers, on a journey to the Tassili and Adjur mountains, several hundred miles to the south. The people of El Oud are famous weavers, and the shops, capped with barrel vaults or small domes, each had a dozen or more black and brown striped woolen robes hanging outside, together with an occasional camel hair burnous, the voluminous cloak worn by the desert nomads. The shopkeepers sat in the square, drinking tiny glasses of tea and playing draughts. In one corner, a crowd had gathered to watch a fortune teller as he laid out rows of cards showing Adam and Eve, soldiers on horseback, and strange cabalistic signs. I bought a burnous, and we drove out of the town in my Land Rover, past gardens dug into the low sand waves lapping at the outskirts. It was like casting off from a small port, leaving the land behind. Indeed, as a desert crossing is often like a voyage across open seas, we knew that until we hit the outlying rocks of the Tassili, there would be little but sand. As the last remnants of Mediterranean North Africa fell away, a grey shrike on a rock, bushes struggling with the blowing sand, dunes appeared on the horizon, first as a scattering of sandy hills rising from the plain, each isolated from the rest except for an occasional linking ridge of sand, then closer together until one dune was piled on top of another in huge massives. As the sun went down, the horizon turned violet and then black. By the time we had made a small camp in the lee of a curved wall of sand, the moon had risen. Its light softened the crests of the dunes, throwing out shadows behind ripples of sand and darkening the cols and the high valleys. A tawny owl hooted nearby, disturbed by our just swimming through the sand with the help of his boat-shaped nose and webbed feet. In the hollows between the dunes, occasional rain must have collected, because there were a few tufts of grass and scattered bushes, each of them an island of life in the barren sand. All the tracks started and ended at these islands, and the bigger bushes had become a busy crossroads for spiders and beetles. Perhaps one of the owls found its meals here. In the days to come, I made it my business to spend the first 2 hours of daylight reading the signs around the camp to discover the nightly events and dramas of the dunes' hidden inhabitants. This was the desert in its gentlest mood, but in the Sahara such calm is rare. There is more often a strong wind, and the traveller finds himself bent over the wheel of a vehicle or the pommel of a camel's saddle, trying to follow a compass bearing or track as the sand begins to blow in tiny rivulets on the ground ahead. Then the desert becomes viciously hostile, and you must make for safety, or, if time and resources allow, simply stop and wait out the storm where you are. This lesson was brought home to me one spring in northern Mauritania. With one companion and a relay of nomad guides, I drove north from the river Niger in Mali, heading for the Atlas Mountains, Morocco. We were following the ancient route along which caravans had taken sugar, cloth and tea south and brought ostrich feathers, ivory, gold and slaves north in exchange. A few caravans continue today carrying salt and grain, but they are rare, and our only companions were small groups of swallows migrating across the desert to their European nesting grounds. After 2 weeks of driving across shifting dunes, making our own route, we reached the gravel plains of northern Mauritania. We were very pleased with ourselves. The worst was over, and from now on we were on a well-marked track. We bought camels for the last of our nomad guides to return home and headed north on our own. Trouble began almost at once. A soldier on sentry duty outside a Mauritanian army fort gave us wrong directions, and by the time it had become clear from the compass readings that we were off course. The vehicle tracks we were following had vanished. Since we were clearly west of the main track, we turned east, thinking that eventually we would hit it. The weather had started to deteriorate. A strong wind was getting up and the air was full of blowing sand and dust, which reduced visibility to a few hundred yards, but intensified the sun's heavy glare. Anticipating trouble, we began to keep a dead reckoning chart, noting every change of direction on the compass, together with the number of miles on each bearing. This way we would be able to work out where we were without navigational fixes on the sun. By now the sand was snaking in little rivulets along the gravel, and even the spiny-tailed Euromastix lizards looking like small crocodiles, which were the only other inhabitants of our hot, ghostly world, had taken refuge in their holes. In the full blast of the storm, we had a puncture. By the time we had changed the wheel, there was sand everywhere inside the Land Rover, inside our clothes. 1 hour more of driving and we had to recognise that we were lost. Our situation, although not desperate, was dangerous. We knew from the dead reckoning chart that we were about 75 miles northwest of our starting point, but even on a clear day, there would be little chance of finding landmarks on this featureless plain. As it was, we were enclosed in a hot cocoon eyes for any useful sign. Recent vehicle tracks, camels, or some topographical features we could locate on the map. We decided the safest course was to return to our point of departure. Our own tracks had been quickly obliterated by the wind and blowing sand, so the dead reckoning calculations were our only link with the inhabited world. Adding up all the twists and turns of the morning's journey, I worked out the bearing which should take us back to the fort. For 3 hours we drove with the compass steady at 155 degrees, using all our strength of mind to resist the temptation to veer off, and follow the occasional tire marks that crossed our path. As evening came, the wind dropped slightly. The dust haze lifted to reveal ahead of us the mud walls of the fort we were searching for. This comparatively trivial incident was an important lesson not to approach the desert carelessly. There is too much empty space for even quite small navigational errors or casual mistakes. It is difficult for anyone used to the scale of wild places in Europe or America to grasp the sheer size of the Sahara. It is by far the world's largest desert, more than 3 million square miles, equal in size to the United States and twice as big as Europe west of Russia. Together with the adjacent Libyan desert, which is merely its continuation to the east, it covers almost the entire northern third of the African continent, from the Atlas Mountains in the north to the beginning of the dry savanna fringe of tropical Africa in the south. In the west it reaches to the shores of the Atlantic, and in the east, with the sole interruption of the Nile Valley to the coast of the Red Sea, this huge desert occupies about 1/16 of the total land area of the earth. On the map, the Sahara has an unreal semblance of occupation. The long straight lines of international frontiers, many of them imposed in the 1950s and 1960s when the French withdrew from their African colonies, pass slit out between Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt in the north, and Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Chad, and the Sudan in the south. 5 main tracks are shown crossing the desert from north to south, with minor tracks branching off. Occasional oases or caravan towns are marked, as well as the half-dozen mining centres that have sprung up with the discovery of oil, iron, copper and uranium in recent years. But on the ground, the frontiers correspond to no recognisable features of the landscape. The tracks are often little more than the tyre marks of the last vehicle to cross, and an occasional stone cairn, half buried by sand. The mining towns are tiny, self-sufficient dots in the wilderness, connected by their own airstrips to Europe rather than to the surrounding desert. A few miles off the track or away from the towns, the Sahara is unaffected by the 20th century. At the centre of the desert, in southern Algeria, is the Sahara mountain chain, with peaks of around 9,000 feet. It is surrounded by lesser ranges. In the south, the Adrar and Iforas and stretch out towards the river Niger and tropical Africa. To the northeast lie the Table Mountains of the Tassili and Aja, dividing the Sahara proper from the Libyan desert and Egypt, while the Tibesti Mountains in northern Chad prolong the US core towards the Sudan and Central Africa. Both the ancient granites and volcanic rocks of the Sahara and the more recent sandstones of the Tassili are blackened in the desert sun. These sombre and forbidding massifs are the backbone of the Sahara. The Sahara is a desert for the simple reason that it rains very little there. It lies on the desert belt that encircles the globe, between about 15 and 35 degrees north of the equator, where wind patterns and the huge distance from the oceans leave the air almost without moisture. 3 or 4 inches of rain a year is generous in the desert. The central regions receive far less, and much of the Sahara does not have a decent shower for more than a year at a time. Some places are extraordinarily dry. Karga in the Egyptian desert once went 17 years without effective rain. When the rain finally does come, it often falls in violent storms that leave nomad shepherds crouched in sodden burnesses and sometimes spell disaster for oasis towns built of mud brick. In 1922, almost all the mud houses of Tamanrasset, a town in the Sahara, collapsed after 2.5 days of torrential rain. Population took refuge in the French fort, but a wall collapsed there too, killing 8 people. The harshness of the climate is increased by extremes of heat and cold. The Sahara is not always hot. Frosts are common in the mountains and northern ergs in winter, and I've often had to thaw out a frozen water skin in order to make breakfast coffee. Sometimes snow falls in the Sahara, but for some of the year the Sahara is very hot indeed. Temperatures in the shade, if you can find any, soar to more than 122 degrees Fahrenheit. The exposed surface of the sand and rock gets much hotter still, and sand temperatures of over 175 degrees Fahrenheit have been recorded. The dryness, the heat and the constant Saharan wind combine to evaporate much of the rain that does fall. Potential evaporation over much of the desert reaches 10 or 15 feet a year. This is what would be evaporated in normal conditions by the heat were such an amount of water to exist, but it does not, of course. There is probably nowhere else outside the polar region so hostile to most forms of life. Plants, animals and people have to come to terms with this harsh climate if they are to survive in the Sahara, and few are able to do so. You can travel for a month on a camel without seeing a tree or more than a few tufts of grass, but after rain, desert flowers and grasses suddenly appear, growing and reproducing with urgency before the moisture disappears. Small carpets of flowers spring up in the hollows between dunes or in the gravel plains, and the dunes themselves may take on a greenish hue from a thin covering of ephemeral grass. In the mountains, cracks in the rocks or natural pools in the canyons fill with water, and thorn trees put on green leaves. Animals too are normally inconspicuous. Many are buff or sand-coloured and merge imperceptibly into the dune landscape. Others come out only at night and spend the day in burrows or in loose sand a few inches beneath the surface. This knowledge that a secret life is going on creates a feeling of mystery about the Sahara, which is deepened by the fact that everywhere in this desert are signs of intense human activity far in the past. There are large, conical tombs made of piled rocks and drawings and paintings on rock surfaces, showing herds of piebald cattle and ritual scenes whose participants wear strange headdresses and body decoration. spears, Stone Age axes, arrowheads, and fish harpoons lie so thick on the ground that you can walk about and pick up half a dozen in a few minutes. There are fossilized fish bones in the middle of arid wastes where it now rains once in 10 years. At times, the desert looks like an inhabited landscape, suddenly abandoned one afternoon, thousands of years ago. There is little legs in unison to follow my movements. Later, before I went to sleep, they filed silently away again into the darkness, but at first light they were back again with a wrinkled old woman, and this time one of them was carrying a wooden bowl of goat's milk, which she put down by the embers of the fire for me to drink. They all sat close together some distance away, watching. Later, I visited their camp of 5 low red leather tents. The men were dressed in voluminous blue robes and black or indigo blue head veils, and some of them carried long straight swords in decorated red leather scabbards. Tuareg, such as these, live largely on milk from the herds. They move with their animals from one threadbare pasture to another, following the pattern of rain, but usually returning to the same well each dry season. It is a difficult existence, and the Tuareg own no more than can easily be carried on a camel or donkey, but their way of life is as well adapted to the harsh desert conditions of that of the animals and plants. Tuareg camps have always attracted me, and I have lived in them for several months at a time. Life in the desert, and especially in the nomad camps, where the protective shield of Western technology is reduced to the barest essentials, was for me a lesson in ecological humility. To rely on the resources of the desert is often not easy, and is occasionally very disagreeable indeed, but for the person who takes the plunge, sleeps out under the stars, and adjusts his activity to the rhythms of the desert, the rewards are great. The simplicity of this life and its frequent pleasures enable you to understand why Theodore Monod, the greatest living Saharan traveller, wrote of this as the largest